We're going to do something a little bit different on this chapter. It's chapter 21, the Great Depression and the New Deal. The chapter in your text is extremely lengthy, and there's a lot of good information in it, but you've already had the 20s and World War I, and we're going to have World War II, so it's an awful lot of information for you to digest. So what I've done is I've gone through the chapter, and I've picked out what I want you to remember. There'll be a lot of information in the chapter I'm even going to mention, so I want you to concentrate on the slides, the word list from the lecture. And yes, I do have a outline of the chapter in there. If you want to read the chapter, I encourage you to do so, but it's not necessary. I want you to remember basically what I'm going to tell you in the next couple of minutes. Going back just a little bit, we're going to talk about the stock market crash in October of 29. And I've given you a few reasons here, just 8, whereas in the previous chapter I gave you, I think, 11. There was a weakness in our economy. There was the unequal distribution of wealth. Agriculture was suffering from overproduction and declining prices and a very heavy debt. The mining industries had the same problem. The banks were poorly managed and were lending more money than they had. And Europe slowed the trade, and Europeans defaulted on their loans from World War I. The government policies reduced tax on the wealthy and encouraged speculation and no regulation. With all this going on in the 20s before the stock market crash, repercussions when businesses are going to lose confidence, and when it crashed, not in 29, it was going to be in the early 30s before it really fully hit. 25% of the workers were unemployed. Farm prices are going to fall 55%. They're going to lose their homes. The disposed people are going to roam around in bands. People move in with their relatives or build shacks like we call Hoovervilles. You have soup kitchens and bread lines, and charities are unable to meet the need of the people. Now, all these things were going on in 29 through the early 30s. Women, they were willing to work for low-paying jobs and were usually the last to be fired. And it caused a lot of problems in the home because a woman was not ashamed to work at any job for food. Anything, she'd scrub toilets if it gave her money to give milk for the children. Whereas a man, and we'd raise them to be this way, be very chauvinistic, they would not work at a job that was beneath them. Of course, married women were fired first. And in some families, I'd say many families, the women were the only support that was provided. The divorce rate falls not because we want to stay together, but because we can't afford a divorce. Marriages get postponed. Fear of what's going on causes a birth rate to fall. And husbands and fathers ashamed that they cannot support their family, because we've been telling them all along, if you're any kind of a man, you will be able to support your family. And a lot of families go without food. Any future education, of course, is postponed because there's no money for it. And boys and girls are staying home from school because they don't have the money to buy shoes, they don't have the money to buy supplies. And thousands die of malnutrition and starvation in the big cities. They die of no hope, no security, no future. And this is not supposed to happen in America, but it is. The minorities, well, the black unemployment rate was twice that of the white people. Mexican immigrants were always afraid they were going to be sent back to Mexico. Racism increases. And of course, very limited assistance for anyone who wasn't white. White charities and government agencies did not offer help to the minorities. And they were forced to live in crowded apartments and pay humongous rents. And sometimes you'd have 2 or 3 families living in 2 rooms. The Hispanics that were unskilled, they lost jobs to the unemployed whites. And all migrants, because of the government, all immigrants were urged to go back home where they came from. Most Americans did protest, but we had organizations and we had seizures. And for instance, in Pleasantville, New Jersey, the people held the whole town hostage. In Louisiana, they seized a train. And of course, the communists and socialists are leading protests. Protests in rural areas also. In Iowa, a sheriff is beaten. In Nebraska, it's threatened to tear down the state capitol. People are scared and they are hungry and they're willing to do anything to get food for their families. A large crowd, this is a picture of a large crowd of Mexican Americans waiting to be deported in Los Angeles in 32. There's Mr. Hoover, and this is a picture of Hoovervilles, shanties. As you can see right here, look at the water. Of course, there's no electricity, no running water. I mean, these places are filthy, but we still are flying the American flag. Sad in a way. Can we blame Mr. Hoover? Kind of, but in reality, all this stuff was in place before he ever took office. He believed in private help. He didn't believe that government should help. He advises and encourages communities and individuals to help those who need help. He said government aid would only undermine the individual's self-respect and expand government, which he was against. And of course, all the private agencies or any type of funds they had for help were very quickly exhausted. He did persuade Congress to cut taxes, but it was on the wealthy. He lent money to cooperatives, and he did reconstruct the finance corporation to lend funds to the banks, insurance companies, and railroads to try to keep them from going under. But the public saw him as uncaring, and I thought anytime he gave a speech, he didn't have his finger on the pulse of the Americans. And much like when George Bush #1 tried to go shopping, he didn't understand about the barcodes, he didn't have any cash. He had never been in where you and I, the common folks, are. And this was a lot of true of Hoover. He wasn't uncaring, he just didn't know what to do, he didn't have good advice, and he couldn't really comprehend what the normal everyday citizen was going through. Of course, his political opponents are encouraging on. Veterans of World War I had been promised that bonus, which we mentioned last time, payable in 1945. Well, they couldn't wait. They needed the money now, so they marched on Washington. Now, back in the 20s, it seemed fair, but the Depression changed the need desperately and also cut back on the money that Washington had to spend. So the veterans marched to Washington to demand their bonus now in June of 1932, which was, well, like 13 years ahead of time. And they erected shacks at the edge of D.C., and the president did a terrible thing. We don't have television per se now, but we've got photographers, we've got movies, and it was all caught in film. The president orders General Douglas MacArthur to disperse them. The assault caused an outrage, and it was all caught on film. The government tried to blame the communists, but the public wasn't buying it. And not next year, but this same year, this was in June, we have a presidential election in November, and any hopes that Hoover had of being reelected were killed with this. Here you have a picture of the doughboys using gas, and their horses and the cavalry marching on the veterans who were not doing anything except wanting their money now. February 33, 6,000 more banks fail. 9 million depositors lose all their money in the banks. And Hoover did nothing. He's a lame duck president. He really can't do anything. And states began closing banks to prevent more runs on the banks, because when people would line up at the bank to take their money out, pretty soon all the money was gone and millions couldn't get their money either. So I'm going to let John Green sum up this period of why the Depression and what was going on. I think he does a real good job of it, and he doesn't concentrate on the New Deal, but basically on the Depression. Oh, we got a
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and Herbert Hoover's here, which is never a good sign. Today we're going to return to two of my favorite topics, economics and inaccurate naming conventions. That's right, we're going to be talking about the Great Depression, which was only great if you enjoy, like, being a hobo or selling pencils. Now, some of you might get a bit frustrated today because there's no real consensus about the Great Depression, and simple declarative statements about it really say much more about you than they do about history.
Why are you looking at me, Mr. Green? I didn't say anything. I thought it.
Because me from the past, you always want things to fit into this simplistic narrative. She loves me not. The Great Depression was caused by X, or it was caused by Y. It's complicated. Many people tell you that the Great Depression started with the stock market crash in October 1929, but A, that isn't true, and B, it leads people to mistake correlation with cause. What we think of as the Great Depression did begin after the stock market crash, but not because of it. Like as we saw last week, the underlying economic conditions in the US before the stock market crash weren't all moonshine and rainbows. The 1920s featured large-scale domestic consumption of relatively new consumer products, which was good for American industry, but much of this consumption was fueled by credit and installment buying, which, as it turned out, was totally unsustainable. The thing about credit is that it works fine unless and until economic uncertainty increases, at which point That's a technical historian term, by the way. Meanwhile, the agricultural sector suffered throughout the 1920s, and farm prices kept dropping for two reasons. First, American farms had expanded enormously during World War I to provide food for all those soldiers, and second, the expansion led many farmers to mechanize their operations. As you'll know if you've ever bought a tractor, that mechanization was expensive, and so many farmers went into debt to finance their expansion, and then a combination of overproduction and low prices meant that often their farms were foreclosed upon. And other signs of economic weakness appeared throughout the decade. Like by 1925, the growth of car manufacturing slowed, along with residential construction. And worst of all was what noted left-wing radical Herbert Hoover labeled an orgy of mad speculation in the stock markets that began in 1927. By the way, I'm kidding about him being a left-wing radical. You just look at him. According to historian David Kennedy, by 1929, commercial bankers were in the unusual position of loaning more money for stock market and real estate investments than for commercial ventures. I wonder if we would ever find ourselves in that position again. Oh right, we did in 2008. Anyway, it's tempting to see the stock market crash as the cause of the Depression, possibly because it turns American economic history into morality play. But the truth is that the stock market crash and the Depression were not the same thing. A lot of rich people lost money in the market, but what made the Great Depression was massive unemployment and accompanying hardship. And this didn't actually begin until like 1930 or 1931. The end of 1929 was actually okay, unless you were a farmer or a stockbroker, obviously. So what did actually cause the Depression? Well, that's a big question, and it's one that economists have struggled with ever since. They want to find out so they can keep it from ever happening again. No pressure, economists. Only 3% of Americans actually owned stock, and the markets recovered a lot of their value by 1930, although they did then go down again because, you know, there was a depression on. And even though big banks and corporations were buying a lot of stock, much of it was with borrowed money, known as margin buying, and all of that still was not nearly a big enough iceberg to sink the world's economy. But if I had to name a single cause of the Great Depression, it might be America's weak banking system. Alright, let's go to the thought bubble. Although the Federal Reserve System had been created in 1913, the vast majority of America's banks were small, individual institutions that had to rely on their own resources. When there was a panic and depositors rushed to take money out of the bank, like they do in the obscure art house movie Mary Poppins, the bank went under if it didn't have enough money on reserve. So in 1930, a wave of bank failures began in Louisville that then spread to Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and eventually Arkansas and North Carolina. As depositors lined up to take their money out before the banks went belly up, banks called in loans and sold assets. Ultimately, this meant that credit froze up, which was what really destroyed the economy. A frozen credit system meant that less money was in circulation, and that led to deflation. Now you're probably thinking, big deal, deflation can't be as bad as inflation, right? No, deflation is much worse, as anyone who has ever slept on an air mattress knows. When prices drop, businesses cut costs, mainly by laying off workers. These workers then can't buy anything, so inventories continue to build up and prices drop further. Banks weren't lending money, so employers couldn't borrow it to make payroll to pay their workers, and more businesses went bankrupt, leaving more and more workers unable to purchase the goods and services that would keep the businesses open. So if we have to lay the blame for the Great Depression on someone, we can blame the banks, which isn't completely wrong, and it gives us a chance to shake our fists at Andrew Jackson, whose distrust of central banking got us into this mess in the first place. That's probably too simple, but the Federal Reserve does deserve a good chunk of the blame for not rescuing the banks and not infusing money into the economy to combat this deflationary cycle. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So economics fans out there might be saying, why didn't the Hoover administration engage in some good old-fashioned Keynesian pump priming? The thinking there is that if governments do large-scale economic stimulus and a bunch of infrastructure projects, it can kind of create a bottom that stops the deflationary cycle. And that does often work, but unfortunately, the Hoover administration did not have a TARDIS. John Maynard Keynes' great work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, he wasn't very good at titles, wasn't published until 1936, when the Depression was well underway. Venturing into the green nightmare of not America for a moment, Herbert Hoover offered a global explanation in his memoirs for the global phenomenon that was the Great Depression. He claimed that its primary cause was World War I, and to be fair, the war did set the stage for a global economic disaster because of the web of debts and reparations that it created. Like under the Versailles Treaty, Germany had to pay $33 billion in reparations, mostly to France and Britain, which it couldn't pay without borrowing money from American banks. In addition, the US itself was owed $10 billion by Britain and France, some of which those countries paid back with German reparations. But then, once American credit dried up, as it did in the wake of the stock market crash and the American bank failures, the economies of Germany, France, and Britain also fell off a cliff. And then, with the largest non-US industrial economies in total turmoil, fewer people abroad could buy American products or French wine or Brazilian coffee, and world trade came to a halt. And then, when what the world really needed was more trade, America responded by raising tariffs to their highest levels ever with the Smoot Tariff, a law that was as bad as it sounds. The idea of the high tariff was to protect American industry, but since Europe responded with their own high tariffs, that just meant that there were fewer buyers for American goods, less trade, fewer sales, and ultimately fewer jobs. So what did Hoover do? not enough. It's important to remember that the American government is not just the president. Hoover couldn't always get Congress to do what he wanted, but his political ineptitude was not particularly surprising because the first elected office that he ever held in his life was President of the United States. Like, let's take the foreign debt issue. Hoover proposed a moratorium on intergovernmental debt payments, and he actually got Congress to go along with it. But it wasn't enough, mainly because the central bankers in Europe and America refused to let go of the gold standard, which would have allowed the governments to devalue their currency and pump needed money into their economies. And when Britain, rather heroically I might add, did abandon the gold standard in 1931 and stopped payments in gold, the US did not follow suit, which meant that world financial markets froze up even further. Like, this is a little bit complicated, but if you and I have always used Cheetos as currency to exchange goods and services, and one day I announced that we can't really do that anymore because it doesn't give us the flexibility that we need to pull ourselves out of this deflationary spiral, if I don't also agree to abandon Cheetos, then it's going to be a total disaster, which it was. And then, even worse, the Fed raised its discount rate, making credit even harder to come by. By the end of 1931, 2,294 American banks had failed, double the number that had gone under in 1930. Now, it's easy to criticize poor Herbert Hoover for not doing enough to stop the Great Depression, and he probably didn't do enough, but part of that is down to our knowledge of what happened afterward, the New Deal. That Franklin Delano Roosevelt at least tried to do something about the Depression makes us forget that when Hoover was president, orthodox political and economic theory counseled in favor of doing nothing. And at least Hoover didn't follow the advice of his Treasury Secretary, who, according to Hoover anyway, argued that the solution was to, quote, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate, which sounds like the worst milkshake ever. Instead, Hoover believed that the best course of action was to use the powers of government to cushion the situation, and in a White House meeting, he persuaded a large number of industrialists to agree to maintain wage rates. He also got the Federal Farm Board to support agricultural production and got congressional approval for $140 million in new public works. Overall, he nearly doubled the federal public works expenditures between 1929 and 1931. It just wasn't nearly enough. Because what Hoover didn't allow was for the federal government to take over the situation completely. He relied primarily on private businesses and state and local governments to stimulate the economy, and that was insufficient. It's not surprising when you consider that in 1929, federal expenditures accounted for 3% of our gross domestic product. Today, it's more like 20%. So it was just really hard to imagine the federal government doing anything on such a large scale to address a national problem because it had never really done that much before. Hoover also hiked taxes as part of a plan to stabilize the banks by balancing the federal budget, providing confidence for foreign creditors, and stopping them from buying American gold. This would support bonds and also keep the federal government out of competition with private borrowers. The Revenue Act of 1932 passed Congress, but it didn't do much to stop the Depression. In fact, arguably, it made it worse. So ultimately, this dire situation forced Hoover into a truly radical move. In January 1932, he and Congress created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was basically a federal bailout program that borrowed money to provide emergency loans to banks, building and loan societies, railroads, and agricultural corporations. The problem was that by 1932, bailing out the banks wasn't enough, and the Great Depression started to take shape. By early 1932, well over 10 million people were out of work, 20% of the labor force, and in big cities the numbers were even worse, especially for people of color. Like in Chicago, 4% of the population was African American, but they made up more than 16% of the unemployed. Although Hoover famously claimed that no one starved, which was a little bit let them eat cakey, people did search trash cans for food, and many Americans were forced to ask for relief. Hoover's response was to try to encourage private charity through the unfortunately acronymed President's Organization on Unemployment Relief, or POOR. New York City's government relief programs rose from $9 million in 1930 to $58 million in 1932, and private charitable giving did increase from $4.5 million to $21 million. And that sounds great until you realize that the total of $79 million that New York City spent on relief in 1932 was less than 1 month's lost wages for the 800,000 people who were unemployed. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? I hope it's a break from the unrelenting misery. Probably not. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document and then usually fail and get shocked with the shock pen, which is a real shock pen no matter what you people say. All right, what do we got here? We sit looking at the floor. No one dares think of the coming winter. There are only a few more days of summer. Everyone is anxious to get work to lay up something for that long siege of bitter cold, but there is no work. Sitting in the room, we all know it. This is why we don't talk much. We look at the floor, dreading to see that knowledge in each other's eyes. There is a kind of humiliation in it. We look away from each other. We look at the floor. It's too terrible to see this animal terror in each other's eyes. I mean, Stan, unemployment was 25%, and this could be literally any of those people. I'm going to guess that it's a woman because men were usually on the road trying to find work while women would go to these offices to look. I mean, it could be me. I have no idea. Janet Smith. Maridel LeSueur. She's a good writer. Maybe we should hire her. So often at Crash Course, we try to show how conventional wisdom about history isn't always correct. But in the case of the hardships experienced during the Great Depression, it really is. The pictures of Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and Steinbeck's description in The Grapes of Wrath of Okies leaving the Dust Bowl in the usually vain hope of a better life in California, they tell the story better than I can. Thousands of Americans took to the road in search of work, and thousands more stood in bread lines. There were shanty towns for the homeless called Hoovervilles, and there were protests like the Bonus March on Washington by veterans seeking an early payment of a bonus due to them in 1945. A lot of the debate around the Great Depression revolves around the causes, while still more concerns the degree to which the federal government's eventual response, the New Deal, actually helped to end the Depression. Those questions are controversial because they're still relevant. We're still talking about how to regulate banking. We're still talking about what the government's role in economic policy should be and whether a strong federal government is ultimately good for an economy or bad for it. And how you feel about the government's role in the Great Depression is going to depend on how you feel about government in general. That said, we shouldn't let our ideological feelings about markets and governments and economics obscure the suffering that millions of Americans experienced during the Great Depression. For generations of Americans, it was one of the defining experiences of their lives. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Miller, written by Raoul Meyer, and made with the help of all of these nice...
I have no idea where the little box came from, and I apologize. Come on. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Paradoxically, he was raised in privilege on a New York country estate, and he came to represent the ordinary American citizen. Like FDR's greatness, like get my tongue twisted. Like Abraham Lincoln, FDR's greatness was his ability to kind of reject traditional ideas while he was looking at a national crisis. He liked to be called FDR, and he was born in 1882, a fifth cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He graduated from Harvard, served in the New York State Legislature as an Undersecretary of the Navy in World War I, and after he ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket in 1920, he contracted polio and lost the use of his legs. In fact, very few knew, and it was a fact concealed in the pre-television era from Americans. Most people had no idea that our powerful president was confined to a wheelchair. In his speech accepting the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, he promised a new deal for the American people. But his campaign offered a very few specific proposals. Roosevelt discussed government's responsibility to ensure that every man had a right to make a comfortable living, but he wanted a balanced budget, and he criticized Hoover for excessive federal spending. The biggest difference between Hoover and FDR's campaign was the Democrats' call to repeal prohibition. Americans desperately wanted leadership, and Roosevelt won an overwhelming 57% of the popular vote in 1932. So the Democrats gained a majority in both houses of Congress. And the Depression, well, the man who was a former governor of New York, he was very pragmatic. Like I said, he didn't mind trying new ideas at all. This is a map of the presidential election, of course. You can see we have very few Republicans. They're getting very discouraged. So almost the entire country went Democratic. We got to do something. He gave the nation confidence. He said we had nothing to fear but fear itself. And as I said, he promised a new deal for everyone. And one of the things he did, he had what they call Fireside Chat to keep the nation informed of what was going on in the government. And this was something none of the other leaders had ever done. And I don't think I've got a picture here, but there's a lot of pictures out there of people sitting in their living room looking at the radio, because we didn't have television. So you gathered in the living room and watched this big old boxy thing called a radio. And he'd talk and he'd say, my fellow Americans, and he would tell you what was going on that was good. He'd tell you what was going on that was bad. And he'd give you a little story about, oh, his dog fellow, a little black terrier. And of course, we all envisioned him sitting in maybe a big recliner in the living room next to a fire, because it was Fireside Chats, right? And maybe Mrs. Roosevelt would be in the kitchen baking cookies. Well, of course, Mrs. Roosevelt never went to the White House kitchen, number one. Number two, these Fireside Chats were done at a desk in front of microphones, but in our mind, this is not the way it was. And he did nothing but instill confidence in us. He'd have us laughing at what his little dog fella had done. He'd maybe torn up a slipper or something, or he'd have us crying because some mother overseas had lost her son. There's some questions I want you to keep in mind as we go through the New Deal. What were the most major policy initiatives of the first New Deal? Yeah, okay, if there's a first New Deal, there must be a second one. Who were the main supporters of the changes, and what did they propose? What were the major initiatives of the second New Deal, and how were they different from the first? And how did the New Deal change the meaning of American freedom? How did the New Deal affect benefits how did the New Deal affect women and minorities and their benefits? And how did the Popular Front influence the American culture in the 1930s? And we'll answer these questions as we go along. But thanks to FDR, the Democratic Party became a party of farmers, industrial workers, liberal intellectuals, African Americans, and surprise, a lot of Southern white supremacists. They all believed that the federal government should protect citizens from modern capitalism. Now, liberalism came to mean government actively helping those less fortunate in society. The coming of the New Deal. They're called the alphabet soup, but we all knew them as an alphabet soup. But this is just a few of them. A National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRC, he appointed Hugh Johnson director. It didn't work because employers used the act to further their own personal interest, and they began to use violence to smother unions. And the government did not enforce sections on rights to collective bargaining and organizing union. But Johnson was very pro-business, but he denounced strikes tremendously. So the crisis right and left. The beginning New Deal did not end the Depression, but it did give people hope. And some people said it's too little, too late. Some said you're spending too much. And some said the people at the bottom of our economic society are forgotten. The communists and the socialists organized workers to go on strike. And employers use excessive violence to end strikes, even more so than they did in the 20s. And four very prominent leaders organized what we call discontent. Strongest opponents were these four. It's good to remember these names. Republican William Lincoln of North Dakota. He called attention to the people in distress in the rural communities because nearly 2/3 of the farmers in North Dakota had lost their farms because they couldn't sell their crops and they couldn't pay their bills. Frandsen Townsend of California was a physician. He called for the government to come up with a pension plan for anyone over 60 to pay them so many money and help find jobs for the unemployed. That sounds a lot like what we've got going now, right? Pension plan. Father Charles Kuglin. Oh, I have heard some recordings of this man. He could charm a bird out of a tree. He was a priest from Detroit and had a weekly broadcast, and millions listened. In the beginning, he welcomed the New Deal, but then he began to condemn it, as he said it favored business and finance. And before you know it, he became almost a spokesman for the Nazi Party. Senator Huey Long of Louisiana. Oh, man. There's the kingfish. I think there was a movie about him just not too terribly many years ago. He was a former governor of Louisiana, and he proposed something called a Share Our Wealth program. It called for a very high tax on the rich to provide an income for the poor and health coverage and old age pensions. Oh, millions thought this was a great plan. But those it was going to affect, like the ones with money, thought, no. And since the ones that had the money or the ones that had the power, it went the other way. And Huey Long got so mad at the governor, he was against him from then on. Here he is, the kingfish, Huey Long. And why called a kingfish? Because of a very racist television program that was popular back in the 30s of African Americans, and the leader who was the leader of the African Americans in his community, head of the lodge, was called the kingfish. Now, we had more than just oppression going on. We had something called dust storms and dust bowl. Now, this is a picture of what was going on in 1935, and they're just about to end by this time. But this is not clouds, folks. This is dust. It was terrible. The dust would come rolling in. And between 1930 and 31, Oklahoma and Texas were the most prosperous regions in the nation. But because of overplanting, overproduction, overstimulation, overcutting of trees, in the summer of 31, we had to have a drought and wind blowing. Oh, the wind started blowing. The drought caused dust and agricultural decline. And more than 100 million acres were turned into total wasteland in Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico. And sometimes the dust that had been picked up in these areas would be blown as far away as New York City. In 1932, we had 14 humongous dust storms. And you could see them coming by looking, and you'd see the dust rising on the horizon. In 1933, we had 38 dust storms. People lose hope. There's a mass exodus. And the immigrants that are leaving these areas are not welcome in California or Oregon. In 1934, the government buys the starving cattle and destroys them. The farmers are upset, but it did keep them from going bankrupt. 1935 spring, the wind blew 27 straight days and nights, and people died of what they called dust pneumonia. Animals died because they'd be suffocated. You would be on a planes in a house, and you'd put, like towels at your windows and rugs at your doors to keep the wind blowing the dust in. And you go to change your baby's diaper, and there'd be dust and dirt in your baby's diaper. There was nothing stopping this wind. It was horrible. And it's not too bad here. But in certain areas of the country, the wind blows continuously, just continuously, and your windows rattle, and the dust comes in, and you just pretty soon you're about to lose your mind. In 1937, the New Deal came up with an aggressive campaign to adopt new planting and plowing methods because we were doing it the same way our fathers had done it. And this is the area, right? In this area, it's called the Dust Bowl. Don't cut down all the trees, and you're going to keep the wind from protecting, and don't always plant in the same direction. When you plow the fields, don't go straight up and down, go horizontal instead of vertical. 1939, we had rain, thank God, and some of the wind stopped. In the 1940, we've got the golden wheat again growing, and the Dust Bowl ended just as quickly as it had begun. And could it happen again? Yes. Are we fighting against it? Yes. In every college and every university in every state, especially in the Midwest, they're fighting and teaching farmers how to do new methods of planting. Don't do it the way your grandfathers had done it. We've got new methods. We've got new techniques. We've got new chemicals. Change your crops. Don't grow the same thing every year. Got new things like computers nowadays. And you can get degrees in agriculture to learn how to do it properly. But it was terrible because most of these people, they farm had been in their family for generations, and now nature's against them. Of course, the farmer's always at the behest of the weather. Did I skip a... Okay, I did skip a slide. I want to back up just a little bit and look at what's going on in the other countries. Now, like I said, we had the Depression here, but because of us cutting back on spending and loans, we caused depression in other areas of the world. Now, we weren't the main cause of it. That World War I and that horrible, horrific treaty blaming Germany was part of it. The worldwide depression produced different results in different areas. For instance, France and Britain, they had very conservative governments, and they did little, if anything. In Germany, a man called Adolf Hitler reorganized the Nazi Party and started a brutal dictatorship which banned all opposition. In the Soviet Union, a man called Joseph Stalin launched a 5-year program that was supposed to end it all and give everybody a job. It didn't. In Japan, we had a very militaristic government. They took over Japan and started to invade China. In the United States, we went from a Republican administration to a Democratic government. And I don't mean democratic form of government. I mean the Democrats are going to be running the government, the Democratic president and his House and Senate. The New Deal is going to change what we mean when we say freedom. Because all along, since our country started, we wanted the government to stay out of our lives. Now, the people are begging for help and welcoming the government into their lives with open arms. So we're going to take a quick look at what we call the New Deal programs, or the alphabet soup of programs. Now, this I do want you to remember. And I've got that document that's posted is, I think, 2 or 3 pages of these particular slides. The first New Deal. FDR's first order of business, of course, was to close all the banks and declare a banking holiday. Okay, where have I got my information on that? Roosevelt had a plan, really. I mean, these other countries are dealing with fascism and socialism and communism, and this is not something he wanted here. He get rid of unregulated capitalism, and he wanted to reconcile democracy with liberty and some economic planning. He had a group of intellectuals to help him work. He hired some very good people and put them in charges of things, and like I said, they were very pragmatic. Although a lot of them were influenced by progressivism. They all believed that the competitive market had disappeared and that large firms should be managed and directed by the government, not broken up. But FDR, realizing that we needed leadership, he acted quickly, and he took office on March the 4th, 1933. He began his campaign of reassuring us with those fireside chats. And his very first step was to confront a banking system about to collapse. Banks that had invested funds in the stock market were falling, and by March of 1933, the banking was suspended in most states. He declared a bank holiday, halting all bank operations, and called a special session of Congress, which on March the 9th passed something called the Emergency Banking Act to provide funds to endangered banks. And then we came up with this Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It was going to insure your deposit up to $5,000. I think it's $200,000 now. But before this time, the banks only operated on whatever was there. And if you were, for instance, a small business who was making money and put your money in the bank and the bank closed, you lost your money. Anyone who had money in the bank lost their money. But with this FDIC, now you have deposits insured up to $5,000 at this point in time. And if the bank closes, you're still guaranteed to get at least that much back. The Tennessee Valley Authority. Oh, I remember that one because we were involved in it living in Kentucky. Yeah, I know Tennessee, but the Tennessee River. They built 21 dams along the Tennessee River, and the Tennessee River actually comes up into Kentucky. Over 40,000 square miles. And they break into private electric companies, monopoly. They break them totally. They're going to make it public owned. They provide flood control, soil conservation, reforestation, and generate cheap electricity for thousands of rural people. My mother-in-law, who lived in Kansas on a farm less than 8 miles outside of Abilene, they paid a humongous amount of money to a private electric company because they lived so far out of town. But with this, the TVA running electric out, they were managed to get electricity for the first time at a cheaper rate. And of course, you had all these people who were employed in building these 21 dams. And that's where my grandfather was involved in building dams along the river. Then you had the Rural Electrification Administration, which collected the money and controlled the electricity and where you went to pay your bills. And I thought everybody did until I was in my 20s and left the farm. You had something called the Soil Conservation Service. It helped the farmers to learn, that's supposed to be how, not how to stop land erosion and plant properly. Like I said, they're going to educate the farmers on new methods of doing things. The Farm Credit Administration. The government's going to allow low-interest loans to the farmers to prevent farm closures. The AAA. Now, this one caused a lot of controversy. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. And I may be wrong, but I think it's still going on in some areas. One of the things that it's hard for anybody to realize, you're a farmer and you grow your corn this year and it didn't make enough money to meet your bills, so next year you grow twice as much. Without realizing you're actually decreasing the cost you're going to get because you're dumping more supply. The law of supply and demand. When there's fewer items to buy, the price goes up. So what they should have done, instead of growing twice as much, they should have grown half as much. Well, some people just cannot accept this concept. So when the government started talking to the farmers out in the farmland, says you're not getting any money for your corn right now. What you need to do is either not grow corn next year or just grow half as much. And the farmer's going, no, I can't do that. I've got bills to pay. I've got kids to feed. I've got shoes to buy. I can't do it. So the government says, okay, I'll tell you what. Don't plant, and I will pay you what you would have gotten anyway. Ooh, what? What did you say? You're going to pay me to not plant my farm. Well, hell, that sounds like a good deal. Yeah, sure. You're going to pay me the money, and I don't have to do the work. That's great. But then I already got these crops in the field that are ready to harvest. Okay, burn them. So anything that was ready to be harvested was destroyed. And I know we've got these long food lines in the city, and the pictures of this were shown on the newspapers, and people got really angry. But you have to destroy the supply to raise the prices. Paid the farmer not to plant. But think just a minute. Now, this farmer used to hire people to help him on the farm. So he's getting money not to plant. He doesn't need these people, does he? So, AAA helped the farmer, but not the farm employee. The National Recovery Act, NRA. No, it's not the National Rifle Association, it's the National Recovery Act. It tried to revive industry through planning, but it caused endless squabbles among the people on the boards, and it did not last very long. PWA, see, we knew all these by the initials. Public Works Administration. It was called what we call pump primer. I didn't spell that right. It should be P-R-I-M. Now, if you've never lived on a farm and you had to go outside and pump water out of an old well, you would pour a little bit of water down the well to prime the pump so you could bring more water up. Now, this was a government putting money into the society to provide people with jobs to get them to spend money. And the government spent more than $6 billion at the PWA. They built dams, they built sewer systems, they did a lot of good. Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC. This is the one that in my area of the country was the most popular. 300,000 young men, I should stress, young white men, were put to work in the parks to plant trees, to build fire towers, because we didn't used to have this technology that we have now, so we built this big tower out in the woods and put a forest ranger up there with a pair of binoculars to see where the fires were. They built parks, they planted trees, they restocked streams, they worked out in the open, so they were very healthy, and most of the time, they were fed and clothed and given a place to sleep, and most of their paycheck was sent home to the family. But no women, no African Americans. Here's the Civilian Conservation Corps workforce in Yosemite National Park in 35. But like I say, in Kentucky, they were very much used. Civil Works Administration, CWA, employed 4 billion people, built 40,000 schools, 3,700 playgrounds, 250,000 miles of road, but it only lasted 1 year because the government decided it was too expensive. But here's my favorite one of all, the WPA. One of my neighbors is trying to lock the door of the car. WPA, Works Progress Administration. It employed 3.5 million people. It built 2,500 hospitals, 5,900 schools, more than 1,000 airports, 1,300 playgrounds. It pumped more than $11 billion, $1930, into the economy. And it had a very unusual feature. This is the first time, the very first time, that federal money is going to touch cultural projects. It began spending money on cultural projects. It hired people to catalog things, to photograph things, to paint things. It hired people to interview former slaves. It gave money to art and theater projects. And as a matter of fact, this is a project that helped Zora Hurston keep on writing. But this is the very first time, and if you ever are responsible for writing a grant, you want to be careful where you get your money from. If you get it from a state or a local organization, this is fine. But if you get it from the federal government, they have the right to tell you how to spend it. And you've got to trace back to make sure that the federal government didn't give this Art Institute money. So when the Art Institute gives you money, actually you're getting money from the federal government. So I don't expect many of you are going to be into grant writing, but if you ever do, you've got to be careful where you get your money, because the federal government has long fingers and they're into a lot of things. They do a lot of good, though. The Wagner Act. Oh, now that's a good one. All of a sudden, we're going to be allowed to, it's the major thing of the Second New Deal. It democratized American workplace by empowering a National Labor Relations Board to supervise elections in which employees voted on union representation. It's sponsored by a man called Robert Wagner, thus the Wagner Act of New York. And the bill also made it illegal to have unfair labor practices such as firing and blacklisting union organizers, that people that had tried to stymie the organization of unions in the past. Collective bargaining was redefined as a critical element of American freedom and now legally protected. It would offer workers a mechanism by which they could win higher wages and thus contribute to the recovery. It was a wonderful thing. It also helped set up the National Labor Relations Board, which I tangled with once upon a time when I went to work. I complained about some unfair practices of my employer, and they said I'm in an old man, and we won't go into that, but it was not pleasant. CIO, Committees on the Industrial Organization of Unskilled Mass Production Industries, and whereas the AFL was all skilled, mostly white, the CIO is going to be unskilled mass production place, and they're going to incorporate women and African Americans. The Social Security Act. You're either for it or you're against it. In order to alleviate the Americans' poor, children, the elderly, and the handicapped. And it was, no matter how you look at it, it was a government goal. The allotment was supposed to be based on previous earnings, but if you had no earnings, how are they going to base it? So there was a flat fee decided. But there was going to be assistance to the blind. They were going to establish unemployment insurance, which is good. Unfortunately, there's large groups uncovered, the migrant workers. They don't pay anything in. The civil servants, the merchant seamen, and day laborers, they did not get that. And Social Security Act did not provide health insurance. It did create the ADC, the Age of Dependent Children. So that was good. And it was unprecedented in American history because it came to be known as the American welfare system or welfare state. But compared to the welfare states in Europe, no, we spent less and covered fewer citizens. When it was originally proposed, it did have a system of national health insurance, which was eliminated by the American Medical Association, who feared that the government would start regulating doctors' incomes and practices. But the ADC was a good plan. National Youth Administration began to employ African Americans and even had a black educator on the board. There was even help for the Indians. The Indian Emergency Conservation Program. Over 85,000 American Indians were employed and provided funds to purchase land, and to roll back the old Dawes Act. So the first New Deal was based on trying to get economic recovery. The second New Deal was going to be based on more economic security. And he kept Congress in session in 1935 to pass the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, the banking reforms, and utilities regulation and taxes. That was the first New Deal. Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, she was the first president's first lady to ever actively participate in government. And she came about because we did not know that FDR could not walk. She became his legs, his messenger. And anytime you saw a picture of the president, he was always surrounded by close friends. He was always standing really close to his friends or his people on the board, or you saw him sit in the car. And you'd see his wife out campaigning for him and delivering information. And she's one we'll learn about in World War II that helped get the Tuskegee Airmen in the air. She also was trying to get more African Americans, minorities, and women involved in politics and involved in the government. And he had a very close black friend. And she managed to persuade FDR to appoint a black cabinet to help him with race relations because he didn't know anything about it. Like I said, he was upper class white. But the Supreme Court kept overturning his programs as unconstitutional. So he came up with a plan. It's kind of funny. It's called the court packing plan. He said, for every justice at the age of 70, we're going to give them a generous pension and we're going to get them retired. And I'm going to double the number of judges. Unconstitutional, number one. Bad plan. He thought it was necessary to keep his programs from being overturned, but it caused an uproar all over it. It was one of the few bad things he did during this time. And by 1938, the New Deal, you would say, was over because they started pulling back. But why was it not more successful? Very simply, the government did not want to have a huge federal debt, or a federal budget either. It did not want to be the nation's employer. And when you get right down to it, a lot of these plans that he came up with and the alphabet soup of programs, they were plans thought of on the run, so to speak. They were not really well thought out. 1938 elections, the Democrats lose a lot of seats in the Senate and the House. They still have a majority. But the conservative Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans are gaining leverage. So the New Deal is basically ending in stalemate. So Roosevelt turned his attention to Europe and the impending war. He could not talk about war to the American public because we were still upset over World War I. And going to war, he would have lost an election. If he wasn't in the power of being a president, he couldn't do anything. So he had a few close advisors that knew what was going on and made some investigation, but there wasn't anything he could do. But backing up just a little bit, during this time, our popular culture followed contradictory lines. Folk culture and tradition embraced and welcomed a lot of it. Some of the modern views, some of them they didn't. For instance, comic books. We had our first comic book of Superman and Batman. On the radio, we had stories told like The Lone Ranger in the Shadow and Who Knows, the Shadow Knows. In the dances, you have Martha Graham inventing new dances all over the place. You had William Faulkner, a Southern author, writing. And don't forget the movies. A fantasy world that helped us have faith and forget our problems for a few minutes. I mean, we knew deep in our heart things were not all fun and dancing and happy. And during this time, we also began to see color talkies. This was really a giant step forward. But in all the movies, you'd have some poor little girl who fell in love with a rich guy and got out of poverty. But there's always somebody poor that became rich. And, you know, the American dream, things are going to get better. And we knew this wasn't going to happen, but we could still go in this nice, cool theater and daydream for 45 minutes. Now, something that's not mentioned in your text, well, just briefly, is the racism that was going on. And I want to tell you about an incident that took place in the early 1930s in Alabama. As I said, our country was very racist, and the Deep South was the worst. So I want you to watch this YouTube, darn it, my tongue. I want you to watch the YouTube and see an example of justice denied. It's called the Scottsboro Boys, and my very favorite, much admired lecturer, Dr. Anderson at Emory University, is going to tell you all about it. Oh, come on. Back up. Okay. I know what happened. Forgive me for a minute. I know how to fix this. Okay. I do this. And then I'll go back to slideshow from current slide, and that should do it. I think I told you how to fix it. I neglected to hit that before.
This program is brought to you by Emory University.
One of the most interesting, crazy, incredible cases of American jurisprudence deals with Scottsboro. Again, you can't understand unless you've got the context of the Great Depression. You have folks riding the rails looking for work just because they can't afford to, you know, I'll go find this job here. So they're just hopping on a train and riding in, trying to find work wherever they can find work. Well, what happens in the Scottsboro case is you have 9 black teenagers, and some of them get in a fight on the train with a couple of white guys. The train stops in Scottsboro, you know, because this fight has broken out. As they're getting off the train, as the sheriff's folks are there, the white guys get off, the black guys get off, and then 2 white women get off. And the townsfolk are looking around going, oh. And the white women, because you've got black guys and white women in Alabama in the early 1930s, I believe 1932. It's like, whoa. And the women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, yell rape and say that these 9 black teenagers raped them. The town immediately took the 9 kids, hauled them in jail. There was a 1-day trial for these 9 kids that ranged from the age of like 12 or 13 to 17, known as the Scottsboro Boys. In this trial, Victoria Price described a horrific rape. Well, the problem was that the doctor who had examined these women said, there's no evidence of rape here. But that didn't stop the jury. The doctor now didn't testify that there was no evidence of rape, but it was very clear that he knew there was no evidence of rape, and he had told folks there was no evidence of rape. These 9 black teenagers were convicted, and rape was an executable offense in the 1930s. And so in a 1-day trial, 8 of them were sentenced to die in the electric chair. The youngest was sentenced to life imprisonment in an Alabama prison. Now, there are multiple problems with that story. One, Ruby Bates, one of the women who had yelled rape, recanted, said it didn't happen. Now let me tell you what really happened here. We're prostitutes. And the Mann Act, the Federal Mann Act, says that we were afraid of getting, because you can't cross state lines for immoral purposes. And since we crossed over out of Tennessee and Alabama, we were afraid that we might get brought up on federal charges, so we were just trying to protect ourselves, and so we just said, rape. Another part of the problem was that first the Communist Party's legal wing hopped in there and took this case up to the Supreme Court to try to protect the Scottsboro Boys. Then the NAACP hopped in it. But one of the major Supreme Court decision was the Powell v. Alabama decision that came after this. Because think about this. You're on trial for your very life, for a crime that never happened. Your court-appointed attorneys, one is the town drunk. I believe at the time he may have had a blood alcohol level of 0.2. I mean, lit. The other attorney in a capital case is probably in about the 4th stages of senility. So one of your attorneys is senile, looking for butterflies, and the other one is drunk, seeing butterflies. Now, the Supreme Court, even the Supreme Court in the 1930s went, really? No, come on. Come on. This is just too much even for us. And they remanded the case, they kicked the case back down. Now, you got to try these fellas again. Well, what happens now that they've got a real legal team is that they began to construct the train and found out that many of the Scottsboro boys weren't even in the same car as the women. So how can a rape happen if the guys aren't in that car? They were convicted once again. Case goes back up to the Supreme Court. By the time there were so many egregious constitutional errors in this case that by the time the Scottsboro case is done, and eventually they start getting let out one by one by one by one, it took first 18 years for the last one. Imagine being in prison, in an Alabama prison. You are 17. You get out when you're 35 for a crime that never happened, a crime where one of the women has recanted, a crime where the evidence demonstrates that you couldn't have done this thing. This would be called an egregious wrong. You also had several who had escaped. Imagine trying to escape from an Alabama chain gang, but they managed to get out. Michigan refused. Alabama tracked one down up into Michigan. Michigan refused, and think about this, a state refusing to extradite a convicted felon back to Alabama because Michigan looked up and said, this is wrong. This is just wrong. The last one was pardoned by Governor George Wallace sometime, I believe, in the 1980s. So imagine again, basically living in the shadows for almost 40, 50 years because of something that never happened, the charge of rape. I mean, Scottsboro speaks to so much in the criminal justice system. But what you also get in this is a series of Supreme Court decisions dealing with the right to competent counsel. Thank God. And the right to have a jury that is really truly a jury of your peers. Now, that is some amazing jurisprudence that is coming out of this case of horrific, egregious, unjust, justifiable. I have no more words for what happened at Scottsboro, but an egregious wrong that, in my eyes, has never been righted.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.
Like I said, I would love to be able to take a course from this lady. She is something else. Come on, Graves. So let me ask you a couple of questions. Was there any difference between the first 100 days and the second 100 days? Who benefited the most? Did the New Deal end depression? And what was the legacy? Think questions. The American government came to believe the federal government was not only responsible for looking after the nation's economic health, but should be a daily accepted presence in their civilian lives. This is the most important legacy, really. The American public changed the way they thought about their government. Now, in the next chapter, we will go back a little bit and see what's going on all over the world before World War II starts, and I hope to get my tongue under control. But meanwhile, like I said, this did not follow your text. I want you to remember basically the reasons and things that were going on to cause the Depression. I'd like you to remember a little bit about the Dust Bowl, and you don't want to know what each one of the programs did, but be familiar enough that if I ask you a question about them, you will be able to answer. And like I say, there is a document that's going to give you a list of them and a very brief explanation. That being said, thank you for